Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList Podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList Podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList Podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today with me is Pat Kua. And I actually wanted to have Pat Kua on the podcast for ages already. I would say he's the most popular independent CTO consultant in Europe. I don't know if you agree, Pat.
Oh, it's very kind of you.
And he's advisor to a lot of companies, one of them being DX, getdx.com. I still remember having the founder here on board, and advisory board of Lead Dev. And he acted as CTO and chief scientist of N26. And he worked for ThoughtWorks and he worked for Oracle. So he has tons of experience in a box, in a nutshell. And he wants to share all of his experience, or at least a bit of his experience today with us. And we're going to talk about individual contributors shifting to technical leaders or engineering managers. So makers to multipliers. He has a very good post on that in his personal blog, which you can check out on patkua.com, which is KUA.com. So PATKUA.com. Check it out. So, Pat, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Toby. I'm glad that we could finally make this happen. And it's really good to be here and excited to chat to you about this topic I'm very passionate about.
So maybe before we talk about like why you're passionate about it, can you tell us a bit more about your personal, let's say, nerd journey? Like, why did you? I don't know if you still consider yourself a nerd, if you still code, etc. You can also tell us all of that. But why you actually decided to get into computing at a certain point?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I actually come from a family of accountants. So my dad is qualified accountant. My sister turned into auditing accountancy. My brother's an accountant. And I grew up in Australia. And in Australia, it's kind of common to do a couple of double degrees. And I actually did a business and IT degree. And I was actually on the path to also becoming an accountant. I had very good marks. I found it fascinating. And then I somehow decided I find the IT side a lot more fascinating. And maybe it's a rebellious act of stepping away from the tradition of what everyone else is doing, and actually thought, well, let's go into IT. I sort of started programming when I was in high school just because of a course that we did. So I'm not like one of those people who I was programming as a kid from very early on. But I really enjoyed sort of what you could sort of create as a programmer developer. And so I decided to pursue the sort of IT path rather than the business path. I'm thankful for the business background, but I really enjoyed doing sort of development. And I think everyone loves that maker sort of, you can imagine something, you can sort of build it yourself and do things. I've always been one of those people who, when I'm writing programs or development, I kind of need to have a goal or an outcome that I'd like to reach. So I'm not I just want to play around with a framework for the sake of it. I kind of want to do something with that. So as an example, when I was at ThoughtWorks, I remember hacking, I don't know if anyone remembers Grease Monkey. It was a JavaScript plugin to Firefox where you could install programs.
Remember that.
Yeah, and I remember getting really annoyed by our time and expense system, for instance, which was a web-based app based on Django. Python. And it was really frustrating because whenever you had to add a row, you had to be connected to the internet. And then you'd click the row and it would take a long time for this new thing to happen. I was I don't have time for this. I'm so impatient. And I was doing a lot of commuting at the time where I was on a train where you didn't have good internet connectivity. at that time. And so I ended up writing a Grease Monkey script that allowed me to effectively save stuff in a table, like on an Excel file. And then at the end of the week, I could just like load up my Grease Monkey script, paste it into a T&E app, and then it would just automatically populate all the rows and, do that sort of business stuff. And so similarly, I don't just like playing around with stuff. I like to make sure that there's a goal. These days, I'm not writing like major programs, but I still do some programming. As an example, I write a weekly newsletter called Level Up. It goes out weekly. And one of the platforms I was using had okay statistics, but it was really bad at the reporting side in that I couldn't really sort of extract that out easily so I could run my own reports. And so, for instance, I wrote a sort of Kotlin Selenium script effectively logged in, pulled out stuff, and dumped all these statistics to a CSV file so then I could do my sort of analytics. Because at the end of the year, I like to share like the most read articles across all of the newsletters. And, that was something that I wanted to have in mind, and it was easier to sort of automate that rather than me sort of click through that. So I can still do these things, but once again, I need a good goal.
A good goal. Can you tell us why you actually became a teacher?
Sure. So for me, I think as a teacher, you sort of get put into this quite a lot as a consultant, or at least the type of consulting that I did. So at ThoughtWorks, where I spent almost 14 years consulting, part of our roles were not only to sort of build sort of software strategic systems for companies, but also to leave the teams that we were working with in a better place so that when we left, people knew how to continue to evolve those systems. Now, we tended to use a lot more of the sort of modern types of approaches and technologies. So a lot of the sort of journey as a consultant, we were trying to help people learn new things. A lot of those new things were, for instance, agile software development back in the day when everyone was doing waterfall. As we were trying to build more distributed systems, doing things like, teaching people how to do testing, continuous integration, eventually continuous delivery. As more organizations started to adopt cloud, we were trying to teach people how to do things like infrastructure as code and think about the sort of operational side. And so I think part of that skill was naturally built into the experiences that I had teaching and growing other people so that we could leave our customers in a better place. We often talk about the Boy or the Girl Scout rule, right? Leave the code in a better place. And we also applied that to the principle of the organizations that we worked with, leave the teams and the organizations in a better place than we left it. So teaching became part of those sorts of natural skills. When I sort of got into this training, I was actually asked by some people internal as ThoughtWorks were trying to scale into Brazil to go and teach people who were stepping from being an individual contributor to leading other individual contributors. Now, it was quite interesting because this was probably more than a decade ago. And if anyone is familiar with the Brazilian market, so I know there's a lot of Brazilians in Germany, for instance, but I think as an industry, it's still a very young tech industry in Brazil because they used to have that sort of brain drain problem where those people who were talented typically got job offers, typically in the US at those times. And as such, Brazil didn't have a lot of tech talent at home because they all left. I think that's changed definitely if we fast forward to today where, you have, more people either returning back home or startups in Brazil. But at that time, we didn't have enough people who had a lot of experience in tech, let alone then leading other people. And so they wanted somebody who had already had a lot of experience to lead other technical teams and to sort of go over and train them. And so that's what I did. And I was lucky enough to visit different parts of Brazil to try to help grow a lot of our team members who are thrown into leadership roles, just like we've all done, just like we've all been through. It's like you're a good developer and then somebody says, oh, do you mind leading this team of developers? And a lot of people are like, yeah, sure. And then I don't really understand what that means, right? And so I've been on that journey and I've helped a lot of people on that journey for quite some time. And I think that's one of the reasons I like getting into the training is A, I never had that when I was going through that transition myself. And B, I've also noticed that a lot of organizations struggle to really fill that gap because if you're a CTO, having been a CTO, I know you just don't have enough time. So you want to help people, but you literally don't have time to sit down and coach and train people on that. And then, typically you get in a HR or a business partner, a people person, and they'll give general leadership training, but it often tends to be too generic for a lot of engineers. It tends to be with a mixed discipline of people from across the business, maybe marketing or sales. And so engineers are like, yeah, that's not really my world. I get the theory, I get the ideas, but I don't understand what that means for me. And so I think it's very helpful to have somebody who's been in that path, who understands this tech world, to sort of do that. And so I really enjoy, going on that path and helping others on that journey.
Okay. Yeah, it's a huge task, right? It's a huge task and a big gap. I see every once in a while, there's HR, business partners, and then for long there's an empty space in many companies out there, right? And good that you picked that up and are filling that gap.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing. I think it's lucky if you already have a HR business partner that is on training, and a lot of startups in particular don't have that. They normally focus on the hiring, the legalities of contracts, and it's not often about training or L&D, learning development. That's kind of a bit of a luxury for a lot of companies. And then even when you do, they're not quite sure how do you support the tech team, which typically has quite different needs, I think, from other parts of the business. And so, I do. I'm very thankful to partner with people in those areas and also to help people. And so that's something that I really enjoy doing for sure.
And the time before you became a teacher, you actually first acted as CTO for N26 and then as chief scientist. And before you also developed. Was there a decisive point for you you kind of stepped from an IC role into a manager and leader role at a certain point? Was there one decisive moment when you said, hey, I have to be an engineering leader? Or how was it? And then from CTO to chief scientist, how did that change happen and why?
Yeah, so I would say no, it wasn't a deliberate choice. I think for a lot of people, right? I think it's not something I ever sought or specifically looked out for. I think it was the case of often being asked, right? Is that I think people go, well, you seem to be able to lead people well, or you seem to be able to communicate with product or business people well. Can you take on this role? And typically that's what happened in consulting, where you often form a new team for each client, and then staffing or business people get involved. They kind of interact with you in previous engagements, or they know about you. And so they ask you to take on this role. So I think a lot of that was more sort of natural. And sort of similarly, when I was approached for the CTO role at N26, I was not necessarily looking for a role. It was actually just something that popped up, and somebody reached out, a personal recommendation from actually probably one of your guests, John Beatol, before, who put them in touch. And it just ended up being a good timing. And I think one of the reasons I take on these roles is, I think as a engineer, I studied a lot about systems thinking, and this is the idea of how systems drive behaviors. And if you're trying to improve an environment, you have to often think about, well, who controls or makes decisions about the system? And that's often leaders or managers. And I think one of the reasons I was happy to say yes to taking on these new responsibilities was you get to create, right, the environment that you would like to have to a certain degree. You can't necessarily control it, as I'm sure all of you listening know this. You have to influence people and you have to get buy-in. But to a certain degree, you have often a lot more say in being able to shape things like team structures or policies or things that can drive behavior. And having been in teams, you sort of think about, well, what are the consequences for that, and how do you enable people like that? And one of the reasons I ended up joining N26 was to help them go on a hyper-growth journey. So we grew the tech team. It was about 50-ish people in technology, and about 2.5 years later, I think we were almost just short of 400 people, so about 380-ish. We'd open a development office in Barcelona, open a development office in the US to support the US launch there. And things were working really well from that sort of side. Now, one of the reasons I transitioned into the sort of chief scientist role is that there was a big focus on delivery and bringing in a director of engineering. They were just pretty much like focused on the delivery and I sort of opted for a sort of different role, which allowed me to be a lot more sort of involved in teams day to day rather than simply keeping on top of a delivery roadmap. It worked well from a VP engineering perspective. But one of the reasons I ended up going independent was throughout my time at N26, we had to, because we were pushing so many people into leadership management roles, I ran a lot of training internally personally. So I think I ran, I don't know, over that time frame, probably 7 or 8 different cohorts, just because of the number of people we were pushing in. And I wanted to make sure that people who were interested in perhaps leading or managing got an opportunity to understand what that's like. Because often in most places, people get asked, but they're not really sure what they're signing up for. And so I wanted people to really have some time to join some experiences with maybe some existing people who were in that role already or hired in. And then to sort of think about, is this something that I want to do? And if so, then it gives you a chance to sort of prepare skills and experiences to do that. And also for people to opt out and say, actually, this is not what I expected, because I think most people expect like an engineering manager role or a tech lead to be like the person who makes all the decisions. And that's often not the case. And as I was running this, I got a lot of requests from other CTOs and VPs of engineering saying, hey, Pat, like I hear you're running all this training. Can you do that for my organization as well? And I can tell you, like a lot of you as CTOs listening to this podcast, it's often more than a full-time role, right? It often absorbs a lot more energy and time than you think. And so obviously I couldn't necessarily do that. And so too bad to really focus on helping more people in different contexts. Then it's one of the reasons I ended up sort of going independent.
I think in the last years, also the picture of the IC was shaped a lot, right? Or let's say the alternative or the career opportunity that you can also stay in IC and that you can like go to a very high level in your company. Do you think this is these days? Do you know of companies where you have like similar chances in the IC shape than in the manager shape or direction?
So I would say a lot of companies have opted for better career progression for people, in that I think if you're an individual contributor on a team, you're not necessarily forced to be a manager. And I think some companies have adopted that. I would say it's a little bit differentiated by region. So you alluded a little bit to, we've got a little bit better. And I would say that if companies are a bit more maybe US-centric or sort of startup focused, they tend to often think about what we describe as a 2-track model. So a management career path of people moving from, say, individual contributor to engineering manager. And then what you allude to, which is the sort of individual contributor career path, which is often then the staff or principal role. Now, some companies and a lot of companies in Europe still don't have these roles. And, you typically have, for instance, maybe an architect role versus a principal, or staff role tends to not necessarily be very common, for instance, outside of my Berlin bubble here in startup land. But in other parts, like in Munich or other sort of very engineering hubs or other countries, it's not a very popular role, or a common role, I should say. And so I would say we've got a ways to go around that. And I don't think that everyone has the opportunity to necessarily stay on that path. I will also say, though, I really don't like the term an individual contribution career path, because I think it's a bit misleading. Because I think when people are, say, a senior individual contributor and they're going on to stay on the IC path, I find there's too much an emphasis on individual contribution. And what I like to explain to people is people who are often at higher levels in that career path, say a staff engineer or a principal engineer or a tech lead, you may not be managing people, but in order to get things done, you need to grow your leadership skills.
Absolutely.
So I prefer to actually talk about a sort of 3-track model, Trident. I have a blog post about this. I can share the link later, where I talk about how what we often describe in our world as the 2-track career path, so IC and management, I actually like to say, well, actually, there's a strong technical leadership path because you focus mostly on individual contribution. You're not managing people, but you need to be able to lead across teams and themes, right? So a concrete example, let's say you're in a big company where you have, 10, 12 different development teams. One activity that a technical leader or a senior IC might have is trying to create alignment across all those 10 and 12 teams about how you use some shared infrastructure like a common messaging broker like Kafka or Kinesis. Now, in that sort of world, you're not really coding your way out of that problem. Is you're talking to people, you're influencing people, you're getting buy-in, which is a core leadership trait. And so I think it tends to be a bit misleading because I think a lot of individual contributors go, well, I want to stay individual contributing, but I don't want to work on leadership skills. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I would say that there are some places for a true individual contributor role, but I would say you only typically find them in extremely large companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon. And what I mean by that is it's effectively R&D, right? So as an example of a true senior IC is it's a person who gets to build their own programming language. Now, most companies don't need their own unique programming language because there's lots of good tools out there, right? But if you're a Google or a Facebook, you often need somebody who can help build the sort of basic infrastructure.
Right. There's in many cases that, or in such big companies, also this one person which is responsible for very, very specific niche technology.
Yeah.
Let's say optimizing the messenger stack in C somewhere, right? Yeah. That in many cases, or as I heard, earns lots of money.
Yes.
And is only doing that and not communicating to many people, not leading anyone.
Yeah.
That's, I would say, also a rare case. Like often, from my perspective, when the company grows and you yourself grow, you have to start talking to people, unfortunately.
Absolutely, you're right. And I think that's the scary thing for a lot of people who say, oh, I want to stay an individual contributor. Because I think a lot of people think, well, it's an excuse not to invest in those skills, to be able to communicate, to be able to influence, to build relationships. And those are really key skills. And that's why I like to emphasize like the 3-track model, where the IC track, truly IC, is not really IC as people talk about it.
Yeah. And you also wrote a blog post I referred to earlier, Maker versus Multiplier. Is that also, I guess that's the same thing, like that you at a certain point have to become more like a multiplier through like spreading your knowledge, spreading your best practice, etc.
Yeah.
And you, no matter if you lead the people directly,
yes.
You indirectly lead, right? You indirectly shape the company, you indirectly shape the path, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I focus on this is it's a sort of internal switch for people who are taking on roles. And that's why I like to talk about this and focus on this. So let's go through an example, right? Let's say that you have somebody in your organization, they're an individual contributor or a team member, and you ask them to suddenly lead this team. Now, you give them this title, right? A lead dev or a staff engineer or tech lead, whatever you want to call it. Often what I notice is when they step into that role, they're still acting like a maker, right? So they think, oh, okay, well, I should be the expert. I have the most experience. I should take on the most complex problems and produce the most code because like I'm the most senior. And they feel that there's this sort of pressure of being the most effective individual contributor or maker. And there's this subtlety, I think, where people are shifted into these leadership or management roles, but there's that internal switch where they need to go, well, actually, my role is not necessarily to be the best individual contributor anymore. It's to be the best effective multiplier because I'm accountable for leading a whole bunch of people. And that shift there is a really challenging one for a lot of people. I mean, I've been through this myself, having made a lot of mistakes, right? You kind of go, well, I can make my team go faster because I've solved this problem before, so let me do this. And I think a lot of people don't realize, well, if you take all the interesting, challenging problems, everyone else only gets to work on boring problems. And then boring problems mean that people don't necessarily grow, they get bored, and often they're going to look for environments where they want to grow, and that's not going to be your team. And so there's some interesting side effects as a result when people don't make that shift.
And what do you think about areas where it is a lot about expertise? Let's say I have a head of platform, and I want that I want her to build or him to build like an internal developer platform, want to build up great infrastructure, etc. Is it then like beneficial to have someone who knows the area deeply, or would you say this doesn't matter in most cases, and you should rather pick an engineering manager instead of someone who sees himself or herself as a deep IC as well?
I think it's super important for senior leaders and managers to have some background in the field that they're leading. I think we often talk about, like, do managers need to be technical? I think there's some challenges there around what do people interpret as technical. And a lot of people think, well, you need to be hands-on. But being technical doesn't necessarily mean you need to be hands-on, for instance. So, the example that you talk about with a head of platform, I think it's essential that that person understands what a good platform looks like, the characteristics of that. They don't need to be the person that's literally building it. And that's one of the reasons they have a team. I think the other side is, as you become more senior in your leadership role or management role, and particularly if you're a CTO, if your organization is really large, you cannot be an expert in all those areas. And so you also then need to understand, okay, well, I need to bring somebody in who knows that domain or field very, very well. So as an example, when I was CTO at N26, I didn't have a background in security, but I knew the importance of security. And I made sure I educated myself a lot in terms of what does modern day security look like, and how do we weave that into our entire sort of organization rather than as an afterthought, right? So I don't have that background. I'm not necessarily driving individual initiatives, but I have enough knowledge of that area that I can understand risk, that I can understand direction around where we want to be. I can lean on hiring people who have perhaps better expertise in different areas, but I'm not necessarily just going to assume that they know. I'm going to challenge. I'm going to ask questions and make sure that their thinking is also just as rigorous. And to a certain degree, if you don't know that area, it gives you the excuse to ask those difficult questions versus if you're the supposed expert and you're supposed to have all the answers, right? And you can ask those dumb questions if you're like, I generally don't have this, so I'm asking this question because walk me through the basics so that I can make sure the thinking is sound, right? And I think that's a very super advantageous aspect. And it's also the fact of why we work in teams and organizations is we can draw on more expertise. We can draw on diversity of expertise. And once again, the leader or the manager doesn't need to be the single expert and won't be at a higher level. And therefore, you need to rely on the expertise that you bring in and understand where your gaps are.
One sentence I still remember, or one manager measurement criterion I still remember from Zalando, where I sold my company to at a certain point, was the idea of flying high and diving deep, which I still like, which is sometimes hard to do, right? I mean, you can't, let's say as a CTO, dive deep in Kubernetes necessarily, but maybe at a certain point you manage to do so and be the expert for like literally an hour and then jump out again. I think that's also a secret weapon that you maybe are capable to do that, and sometimes maybe really dig deep and then like zoom out again and leave that level again. Do you think it's healthy to do that?
I think absolutely it's healthy to do that. I think one reason is I think if you're flying too high too long, you get a little bit out of touch with the reality. And I find it's healthy to do a bit of a deep dive, not necessarily to impose your will on teams or people, but also just to get a bit of empathy and understanding about what challenges are they facing. Because I think this is the problem with being a higher level leader is you often assume that everyone has your information, but you might actually learn by doing a deep dive that there are some real world constraints that teams are really struggling with. Some of those constraints might be just the logistics of how complicated a process is for people to get some normal task done. And that gives you some insight into things that you can do to help streamline the team's effectiveness as well. And, I grew up in the sort of age of agile and lean. And I think one of the lean things that I remember is this idea of go to the Gemba. which is, go and see the work. And for me, that's really about that deep dive that you talk about, which is if you never go to spot, what people are working on and how they're working on it, it's hard to pick up problems that people are having, which typically as a manager, you have authority or the ability to influence and improve. And if you're relying just solely, as much as I love surveys and collecting things like that, sometimes the most effective way is literally to go to the Gemba, which is a deep dive in your perhaps example that you talk about.
Okay. I think many CTOs also tend to experiment with smart home, etc., to kind of stay in the game, right? do you do something similar like that? Like, how do you keep your mind fresh?
So actually, I actually prefer a very dumb home. So given my understanding of security and organization's ability to maintain things over time, I'm actually very happy for a very dumb, unconnected home. So that's just me personally from a risk factor. But for me, one of the things that I tend to do often, and this is a luxury, I would say, of my current role, is I tend to do a lot of broad reading. When I'm doing my newsletter, I like to share the best articles I've been reading around leadership, technology, organization, and processes. And that puts quite a lot of pressure on me to sort of keep up to date with what's going on. What I tend to sort of focus on in terms of knowledge is kind of thinking about sort of hierarchies of knowledge. And the lowest hierarchy of knowledge is the syntax, or the do I know how to type something in and make a tool work? That's not so important to me than thinking about the concept or the principle. So as an example, when everyone was talking about Bitcoin and crypto, I would probably say, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, I did a lot of research into understanding, okay, well, what's the idea behind Bitcoin and crypto? And because I'm really focused on what is the application or goal of that, I'm kind of like, well, I don't really care about which implementation of that you're talking about. I'm trying to think about, okay, distributed ledger, right? Like, what does that mean? And what's the application of that? What's the business value behind that? So then I can evaluate, if it's useful in a particular context. I'll then educate myself on something if it's becoming a little bit more practical and realistic. So if we fast forward to today, I'm pretty sure everyone's still talking about the idea of what's the impact on machine learning or AI, particularly on development efficiency, right? There, I think there are some immediate practical concerns or applications of the technology. And so I'm doing a lot more reading around, it's a principal idea, but it's actually obviously showing impact and value on the organization. So I sort of prioritize more reading around that. The other thing that I like to focus on is I think everyone can always talk a lot about the ideal, right? Like with the what ifs. We heard this a lot in the Web 3.0 space, is that the potential of all these things. I like to focus in on what are the use cases or the case studies. So what have people actually done with this? Because I think this is really how we learn, right? I think this is how we share knowledge, which is, we have this problem again and again. Somebody has suddenly solved this problem through a nice, elegant way. That elegant solution often turns into either an open source tool in our world, or perhaps a pattern that then other people can apply, and then everyone's lives are a lot easier. And so for me, I tend to focus on if there's a useful, interesting concept or principle, what are the applications of that? Start to look at, trying to find case studies or applications of it and people sharing lessons learned, because I think that's where a lot of the value is at then sort of pushing our field forward. And I'll tend to prioritize that over the hypotheticals and could be sort of way without actually any demonstrated value. And that's just my own personal approach at sort of keeping up to date with technology. And then sometimes it means like tinkering around with some stuff. So as an example, playing around with all of these AI tools. Like yourself, I also run a podcast called Managing Managers now. And one of the things that I was trying to experiment with was, what could tools do to help me speed up my productivity for some of that? And so I was like doing some research around tools that could do sort of automated video editing and various things like that. And so it gave me a chance to apply, some theoreticals of doing a bit of a evaluation of what tools could actually help me. And so once again, I really focus on the value behind the technology, not just the pure tech by itself.
So you like spending time in problem space and focusing on outcome then, I assume.
I think that's a good summary.
Okay. What do you think about the like if you transition from an IC to or from a maker to multiplier, how do you ideally measure your own effectiveness?
So I would probably go back to the Andy Grove's definition. So Andy Groves wrote the book High Output Management. It's an old book, but a lot of people refer to it in the engineering management space. And I'll loosely paraphrase what he talked about, because in the context of his book, he talked about management. And he talks about how the output of a manager is the output of the team of that person's managing, plus the sort of influence over other teams that person engages in. That's still a good heuristic, even if you're not managing people, which is, if you're a maker, you're very much focused on your individual contribution. For a lot of people, this is often how many features or how many tickets or stories, whatever you use to track work that you are personally producing. And to a certain degree, I often describe leaders, you kind of end up sort of loosening your focus a little bit. And so it's not a focus on you, but it's a focus on the team that you're leading. And so, for instance, the thing that I would be focusing on is, rather than seeing the productivity of myself and how many tickets or features that I'm dealing with, then I'd be looking at the sort of productivity of the team that I'm I'm leading, which is typically then how many sort of features or tickets that my team is producing on a regular cadence, like weekly or fortnightly. But I would also say it needs to be done in a sort of sustainable manner over time. So, because I think everyone talks about this, right? When it comes to measuring productivity, is you can cut corners, you can get rid of tests, you can get rid of like automated stuff, but over the long term, it'll get harder and harder to do that sustainably, because either you'll have more production bugs. Production bugs are effectively a form of failure demand. That failure demand distracts you from planned work. And that's eventually going to cut into your ability to do things well. And so that's kind of the general measure, which is like, how more effective is your team today than it was, say, 3 or 6 months ago? And of course, how you define that and what you measure can be quite complicated, but the question still remains, right? How have you multiplied your team? Sometimes that's about sharing knowledge or getting people to swap knowledge amongst themselves. Sometimes it's about bringing in expertise outside, and then when that expertise leaves, the team can continue dealing with things. Sometimes it's often about the risks or the unpredictability of that team. So let's say a team is producing some technical system and there's a lot of production issues. I would hope over 3 or 6 months of leading that team well, quality goes up. And so this means that actually there should be less and less number of production issues being reported, which means the team can focus on planned work a little bit more effectively. And so that's a different measure of how you might talk about how somebody has multiplied the effectiveness of a team. So the rule or the heuristic still holds, but once again, the situation is very different depending on where that team is at.
Okay. Yeah, very, very, very helpful. So for the platform team that I mentioned, you would look at uptime and how did that change, and issues being reported, etc. Understood. That's clear. And talking again about ICs, and maybe some tips for ICs transferring into managers. From your experience, what is the hardest skill that ICs actually have to unlearn when they move into technical leadership roles?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are many things that people have to unlearn. I think one of them we talked about already, which is that mindset shift of focusing away from yourself and focusing on others. I think one thing which I would say is very common for people in technology is, I am also an introvert. That's where I get my energy. A lot of people in technology are introverts. It's one of the reasons I think a lot of people gravitate towards being an individual contributor, is you often don't necessarily have to interact with people if you're focused on, coding or producing something at your computer. That is difficult for people when they step into a management role, is that suddenly they have to talk to people. right? They have to talk to people in their team. They have to talk to people often from many different departments. So be it product, which is maybe part of your team, but a different sort of function. But then also if you're in a product area, you might need to talk to operations. You might need to talk to customer support. You might need to talk to high-level management. And that is a very uncomfortable thing for a lot of people when they transition from being an individual contributor to a manager. And so one thing I think which is very important to do is to really invest in your communication skills. Is that we think we're good communicators, but your strength of your skills will really be tested when you're in a management role. Firstly, it's because often a lot of the people on your team will not be exact clones of you. And so one part of communicating, even with other similar people in that field, is learning how to communicate differently depending on people's different preferences. So, I think even when you're trying to communicate some organization decision to your team, for instance, some people have some preferences of, read stuff asynchronously. So be it through Teams or Slack. Other people, regardless of what you send to them, they will not read it. And you have to talk literally through the message for them because they prefer to be interacted with in that sort of fashion, right? You might consider, well, it's a waste of your time, but actually you're not communicating effectively if the message doesn't land. So you think you've communicated, but it's not been effective. And so learning different communication approaches and styles is really important for dealing with different types of people. And then when you're dealing with people from different teams or departments, I like to encourage people to imagine you're literally talking to people from a different country or culture. And so, when you're talking to somebody where English is not their native language, it's a bit hard in the real world to suddenly speak another language, but simply repeating the words in English is probably not going to help. You have to learn a few of their words so you can communicate. And that's very similar, is that when you're talking to people from finance, they will not understand anything you say about cloud, DevOps, SRE, observability. They will be talking about money, right? So what does that mean? Often CapEx and OpEx. And so you have to learn the vocabulary in order to better communicate. And I think that's a really important sort of heuristic I like to teach.
And I mean, from your perspective, is there maybe, or do you have a favorite communication channel at least where you think like this is effective, this works for 90% of the organizations? Or
I know my preferences. So yeah. I tend to be a bit more of a written style because I find I'm a speed reader, so I can digest a lot more text. It's one of the reasons, for instance, I don't actually like listening to podcasts or videos so much. Or when I do, I prefer to have a transcript so then I can literally read it. Even, if you're double speed playing a podcast or video, I find text is just a lot easier for me to consume. But I also recognize that other people aren't like that. And so I think if you're a CTO, if you're trying to communicate something important, what I encourage you to think about is levels of redundancy. So, I would, for instance, if it's an important message, you probably typically do something like a town hall meeting where you talk through some of that. Given the distributed nature, it makes sense to keep a digital recording of that so people can play that back. But then typically I would then link out to perhaps a blog post. So for those people who prefer to read something. But once again, there's the idea of push versus pull communication, right? So if it's a blog post, somebody has to go there, and some people will not go there. And so sometimes if it's really important, then you have to also then push messages out to people, which typically means an email out or a Slack or a Teams message out with the same information, but then sort of connecting them all back so at least they're consistent. So that's one of the dangers, I think, when you have different channels, is you might end up communicating the message differently each time. And an important part there is really being consistent in your messaging. But trying to make sure that you have different channels. One of the little sayings that I like to have is, as a developer, you probably learn the DRY principle. Right? Don't repeat yourself. And for managers, I encourage you to embrace the CRY principle. A, because it's hard and it's going to be emotional anyway, but to continually repeat yourself. Right? So don't just assume once is going to be enough. If it's important, do it a few times.
Or just replace don't with do repeat yourself.
Or do, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's hard. I mean, communication is hard, really. And I see so many cases where people think that a doc in Notion is probably enough.
Yeah.
Which is not true, right?
Absolutely. No. So, another sort of example of this is like the difference often between UDP and TCP, right? Which is a lot of people think about the UDP, I just send it, fire and forget, and I assume it reaches its target audience. But same thing with UDP is it's lossy, is that there's no guarantee the message arrives. And so this is where TCP is useful, which is you have to check, and that takes more time. And so people who are trying to be too efficient may not necessarily be effective.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That's a great comparison, actually. I have to keep that in mind. So we slowly have to come to the end. I want to come to my outro question I prepared for you. It's a little surprise. Actually, a former colleague of mine, Christian Rebernick, who acted as CTO, I think, before you at N26, right?
Yeah.
He actually told me a little secret about the N26 mobile API, which had some security flaws, etc. I think you were involved. It's actually in the transaction history. You have to change a get parameter, and then you can basically travel back in time. So you just change the year. You can even change the account, and then you go into other people's account. So don't worry, we're not going into deep diving into your bank account, but I now will use that API on my computer here to kind of travel back in time in your personal transaction history to the year 2017 when you actually started as CTO at N26. And we can now observe yourself. You, I think, deep diving into security back then and learning a lot about the field. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Pat's ears. What would it be?
So firstly, I will say that the security incident happened before my time, and that was actually dealt with. So I had also read about that before I joined, which also made me have some questions about whether I should have accepted the offer. But once again, being able to influence and change that, I think that's fine. What I wish that somebody had maybe told me or whispered into my ear at that time was how long hiring cycles in Germany can be. So this is something that I really underestimated because I had moved from the UK, where you can generally hire people pretty quickly. But because of longer notice periods and leave periods in Germany, which are completely understandable, sort of 3 up to 6 months for more senior roles, that means if you're trying to hire some senior people, it's really painful knowing that you've maybe filled a spot, but they can't really join your team for a long time. And this is one of the difficult things going through hypergrowth is, I think somebody once told me it's like you're spinning 12 plates. 6 of them are going to drop at any time. You can't do anything about them, right? Like, in a good day, you can keep everything running, maybe 1 or 2. But in a hypergrowth world, you kind of have to accept that a lot of things are going to be broken. And one thing that really helped was, you knew at some point in the future, you had a strategy or an approach to resolve it. You can't do anything about the timing. But wow, that was really a painful learning experience of, okay, I know I need to get in these roles or these skills. We found these people, but it's going to take a long time for them to join. And so I think that might have changed perhaps some of the priorities of where I spent time or maybe brought in interim type of skills as a result. But that was one big learning I wish somebody had told me when I first joined.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Lots of insights, very, very helpful.
You're welcome.
And any last shout out from yourself?
I mean, if anyone is struggling with or not having enough time to help their people transition from being individual contributors to tech leads or engineering managers, reach out. That's some of the stuff that I do with training, both remotely and in person. And if not, then at least join my newsletter, Level Up. It goes out weekly, and I like to share the best articles around leadership, tech, org, and processes. So all the areas I think tech leaders need to stay on top of.
Yeah, it's really a good newsletter. Check it out.
Thank you.
And Pat, thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me, Toby.
Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.